Welcome everyone to this Ontario Native Literacy Coalition webinar. I am Sarah Stalker with Contact North, and I'm going to turn you over to your moderator, Yuma Hester. Yuma, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for the introduction and the virtual hosting duties. So my name is Yuma Hester. I'll be the facilitator. I'm a half Cree, half Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe from Neashingming, Cree side from Moose Factory by way of Waskaganish. I want to welcome everybody, all of our esteemed participants and all the supporters. Thank you very much for introducing yourselves and letting us know where you're from in the chat feed. Love to see that. Whether you've been to one of these webinars or not in the past, or this is your first time, I want to extend a huge welcome and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today and listen to our great speaker. So we want to begin shortly here, but I will take a few moments to do sort of a quick review to let anybody who is new to the series know how it's going to play out. So the presentation will go for about 45 minutes and it'll have a slide deck that Dr. Cajete will be sharing with us in a moment. If you have any questions, please hold on to them until the end of the presentation. And if you can't and you have to write it down or you might forget it, then feel free to write it in the dialogue box. And at the end of the presentation, I'll facilitate as many questions as possible right up until the end. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce everybody to Dr. Gregory Cajete. He's a Native American educator whose work is dedicated to honoring the foundations of Indigenous knowledge in education. Dr. Cajete is a Tewa Indian from Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico. He served as a member of the New Mexico Arts Commission. In addition, he's lectured in colleges and universities in the United States, Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, England, Italy, Japan, and Russia. And Dr. Cajete is currently a professor of Native American Studies and Language, Literacy, and Socio-Cultural Studies at the University of New Mexico. Welcome, good sir.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Yuma. Just one correction, I actually recently retired from the University of New Mexico. I'm now an emeritus professor with the university.
Brilliant, congratulations.
So I'm as they would say in the craft, I'm deinstitutionalized. So
excellent.
So, well, I guess I'll just go ahead and begin. Just a little bit more in terms of introduction. I actually have done quite a bit of work and many presentations, throughout Canada. So I'm happy to have this opportunity with Yuma and Sarah to share some of my thoughts and perspectives about Indigenous education, Native science, sustainability, and research. Actually, health research, which I think is very appropriate, given our situation with COVID-19 and some of the kinds of issues that many of our Native communities are facing, the challenges they're facing, with regard to healthcare and really, the challenges of this particular pandemic. So I'm hoping that some of the ideas and perspectives that I'm about to present will give you some insights into a lot of things, a lot of perspectives, I hope this will generate good discussion and dialogue among yourselves. Will give you some insights into some of the wherewithals, that I think we have to really begin to consider as Indigenous people, as Indigenous community members, as Indigenous researchers and health workers and educators and social workers and so on, you know, in terms of what lies in the future. Again, you know, I've been an Indigenous educator for 46 years now. I started my career at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I began as the high school science teacher. One of my degrees is in biology, so I trained as a field biologist, and so I've sort of carried that that kind of training and that kind of perspective into my teaching over these 46 years. But I spent 21 years at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I was dean there, which is not a kind of role I expected to have, but nonetheless, you know, I performed that role. And also then moved on to the University of New Mexico, where I took over the Native American Studies program. I was hired as the American Indian Education Specialist in our College of Education, and then also took on the role of being director of Native American Studies, which was actually in another college. So I played roles in the context of the University of New Mexico, and I stayed there for 25 years. And as I said, I just retired in June, you know, from my position there at the university. So again, my work is extensive, particularly in terms of Indigenous education, with a focus on Indigenous science education. I've written a number of books that deal with different aspects of my work and research, and I continue to do work in this area. My most recent books include Native Minds Rising, and the other book is called Sacred Journeys, and this is actually 2 edited volumes of the work of my students, you know, over the years, who have taken on some of the challenges and ideas that I presented to them, and have made it their own, and have become, you know, researchers in their own right. So I really do encourage you to look those books up. Native Minds Rising and Sacred Journeys. The publisher actually is in Canada, John Carlton Publishers Limited, out of Vernon, BC, Canada. So so they are widely available, you know, through John Carlton Press, and hopefully you'll get a chance not only to read some of my work, but also some of the work of my students over the years. Quite impressive in terms of the new generation of Indigenous scholars that are following in the people like myself in our footsteps. So with that introduction, I want to get right into the presentation. So if you'll give me a few seconds, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get that PowerPoint up so that we can start our discussion in this regard. So here it is, and let's see. Let's go ahead and make it full screen. And there we go. It should be full screen now. Okay, so the formal title for my presentation is Building Healthy and Sustainable Indigenous Communities Through Research. And one of the reasons I chose this particular title was, of course, because of the issues we're facing, you know, with the pandemic and with COVID and a number of other issues that we have in our communities with regard to health. But also because I feel that we have to expand the notion of research beyond just something that people do in universities, but rather to really own research as something we do as Indigenous people, as actually we have always done as Indigenous people. We didn't call it research in, you know, in that community context or that traditional context, but nonetheless, it was something that we were able to do and did do extensively. And I think we have to pick that up again and make it our own in ways that will help us address many of the issues that we have before us in terms of health, in terms of climate change, and the like. So the first slide is a slide that comes from a 1,000-year-old membranous pot or plate. The membranous people lived in southern New Mexico and thrived there until about 1100 AD. The record they left of themselves was their pottery. And they became very famous for a particular kind of black and white reproduction of pottery. But for me, the symbol of this is really a whole story unto itself, in that you can see that sandhill crane, which are here along the river in New Mexico as we speak, and the human effigy figure. And what's important to note about this design is that it's a positive negative design. So it's actually one design. It's just one design made to look like two different entities. It's positive, negative. The sandhill crane is the part of the design of the human effigy figure. The human effigy figure is a part of the design of the sandhill crane. You can't pull them apart. They're surrounded by the force and energy of nature. And for me, it kind of epitomizes the indigenous worldview in the context of this interpenetrating interdependence that indigenous people feel for their environment and for all that is in their environment. So you can't really separate one from the other. We are one thing. We are the sandhill crane. The sandhill crane is us and or any other kinds of animals that are a part of an indigenous territory. So I think it's an appropriate way to start this presentation. Human and environmental interdependence is really the historic basis of indigenous well-being. And, you know, as you go around the United States and Canada, you find different kinds of expressions of what we call the world renewal ceremonies that indigenous people practice, usually in timing with the summer solstice or winter solstice or the equinox, fall and spring. This particular slide represents the first salmon ceremonies that are practiced in the Northwest part of North America. And they represent a kind of complex of honoring and renewal and healing related to health and well-being, not only of the human communities, but also of the natural communities in which they were situated. Again, I want to really emphasize that as indigenous people, we had numerous kinds of these kinds of ceremonies. And I'm just using, you know, in this case, the first salmon ceremony as one example, but again, you could go around and find these kinds of ceremonies being performed for those benefits and for those relationships, reestablishing and maintaining and extending those relationships with our natural resources and with each other. And I shouldn't really call them resources, with our natural kin, you know, because resource is really an English word that represents a whole different kind of mindset. So let's call them our animal kin, our plant kin, you know, or the kin of the places in which we live. So think about that, you know, as I move through this presentation. You know, one of the things I've become very interested in, really even before COVID, but more particularly now because of COVID and its impact on our indigenous communities, is this really deeper thinking about what is health, what does health mean, both at the individual and also at the communal level, and how can we begin to once again teach ourselves, learn through ourselves and through our communities and through our experiences, our own forms of health education. So this requires, teaching and learning, which is transformative and anticipates change and innovation. It requires a kind of Indigenous health education that can integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate community environmental knowledge. It requires a kind of health education that forms a foundation for community renewal and revitalization. So it goes beyond just really addressing the challenges of a pandemic like COVID, but also really goes into the very heart of what it is to be healthy as individuals and also as community. This particular slide is the October issue of the National Geographic magazine in 1992. And the cover is of a native artist rendition of Turtle Island. And I like this particular rendition because symbolically, I think it represents this the whole notion of what an indigenous ecological paradigm, which is inclusive of health and relationship and balance and ecological sustainability, bringing it all together in a kind of enlightened consciousness that's represented by, that halo that the figure has on top of his head, and the notion of Turtle Island. So I think it really speaks perfectly to the kinds of things that we are beginning to really explore, among ourselves as Indigenous people. Here's another piece done by a artist from Santo Domingo Pueblo, whose name is Manuelita Lovato. And it depicts, from my perspective, the people, the indigenous peoples, and the clans of Turtle that make up Turtle Island. And it's a very beautiful piece. Again, a way to symbolize this idea of we are related, we are all members of what we call Turtle Island. So what are some foundations that you can begin to reflect on as you, think about what is Indigenous health and what does that mean, and what does it mean in the context of not only COVID but also the climate change, phenomena, and also many of the issues that we currently have among our Indigenous peoples in our communities. Well, one of the foundations is actually knowledge, and I call this slide the foundations of Indigenous knowledge, or you can call it the 4 directions of Indigenous knowledge, beginning with traditional knowledge, which is handed down based on stories and experiences of the people through time. Empirical knowledge gained through careful observation and practice over time. Revealed knowledge, which is gained through vision, ritual, ceremony, dream, those forms of knowledge. And then what would be called contemporary knowledge, gained through experience and problem solving. And modern education would also be included, as a form of contemporary knowledge. But all of the forms of knowledge that we exist in and that we use today as contemporary Indigenous people. So these are the 4 directions of Indigenous knowledge that we can begin to bring together in some kind of creative synthesis around some of the issues and to address some of the issues of Indigenous health. There is also, this whole notion of what is traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge is basically combined with empirical and contemporary knowledge becomes a foundation of the knowledge systems we use today. As I say, they're all foundations of Indigenous knowledge can provide us with models and creative insights necessary to renew and revitalize the health of our human communities and our economies. The two pictures, one is of the Pueblo emergence myth to the right-hand side that depicts our emergence story among the Pueblos, which is, in short, we as human beings have been evolving through 4 worlds of being. Each world of being is more complex. As we emerge into those worlds, we have to learn new lessons, have to have new understandings and insights that we build on to create that world. That world comes to some sort of closure. We have to emerge again into another world of being. And our stories, of course, talk about that process of very similar to the Western concept of evolution, as human cultures and human beings evolve, gradually through generations. So in the case of the Pueblo story, we emerged from the Earth navel, from one of these worlds. We walk a path. That path, we're guided by sacred beings. We're greeted by the sun and the moon and the mountains and animals, which act as our guides as we move and develop and learn in that world of existence. Some of our Pueblo elders say today that we are emerging yet into another world. And I think that's very, very poignant, at this point in time to relate that we are moving into a new world of being where we have to now develop new insights, new forms of knowledge to help us sustain ourselves. The other thing about Indigenous knowledge is that it's a form of sustainability knowledge or sustainable knowledge, that it prepares us to sustain ourselves in the worlds in which we live. And then, of course, the spirit of learning, the spirit of teaching among the Pueblos is personified in the figure in the form of Kokopele, which is on the lower right. That's the creative human spirit, the spirit that learns, the spirit that gives us the desire to learn and to be who we are. One of the things that's very difficult for us to do is really take a look at our own complicity with our situations. So as concerned people, we have to take a look at a long, hard look, an honest look at the current health, educational, economic, institutional, and governmental, and community development policies, planning, and processes, which make us complicit with the status quo. And that's a difficult thing to do, but yet, in order to have something that is transformative and that moves beyond the status quo, we have to begin to consider, how we ourselves have been complicit in much of what we are now dealing with and the challenges that we have before us. So now comes in the theme, which is really thinking about a new generation of Native health education and research. And this is a new kind of education predicated on guiding Native people towards this vision of health, revitalized, sustainable, and economically viable Indigenous community. And so that, in a sense, is a mission statement, for what I think is very important for us to consider at this time. In that context, we also have to consider the process of doing that, which is really a form of research, Indigenous research. Indigenous research as story, as a process for coming to know once again, as a knowledge creation to increase well-being, and as a process for empowering. Now, I really, really want to emphasize in this that in a Western academic world, that research is largely captured by universities and now being deinstitutionalized from one such university. I am openly advocating that that research has to be liberated from our institutions. That doesn't mean it doesn't continue to be done in those institutions, but that should not be the only place that it should be done. Research is something that is a process that all and capability that all of us possess, depending on the situation, you know, and certainly in terms of our own history as Indigenous people. We have always been researchers. You know, we couldn't have solved the kinds of issues and problems of sustaining ourselves in our environments, you know, if we weren't researchers, and very good ones, actually. So again, rethinking, you know, what is research, and really liberating research from that academic world and making it our own, once again, I think is a very important piece of this, this process. So if you take a look at Indigenous research and evaluation, you're looking at, first of all, beliefs and values, knowledge creation. It's done among people and in place. It applies personal gifts. It has community focus. It has a family focus. It deals with tribal sovereignty. In that context, in that process, context is critical. Place-based programs are important and critical to set up and strategize. The studies should be place-based, including the whole person, not just an intellectual kind of exercise, as we say in profession, contemplating your navel, which is sometimes said of what researchers do. You know, that research has to be community-oriented and affect families and develop ownership and capacity among those or among that which you are researching. So that's in a nutshell, you know, some of the perspectives of what Indigenous research would probably and should look like, and indeed is beginning to look like as Indigenous people do more of this kind of research in their communities and in their places. There are certain kinds of frameworks, you know, that are used in Indigenous research. The first and foremost is framing it in an Indigenous community, using Indigenous metaphors of research, which drives Western academics crazy, you know, when you use Indigenous metaphors, but nonetheless, it's extensive and being used more and more by Indigenous researchers. It's about creating knowledge which actually benefits community. It has real benefits. It builds on core cultural values. It's about creating or recreating guiding stories through that process of research. Building the Indigenous scaffold for research is something that I really emphasize, because even though we have a lot of Indigenous researchers, we don't have enough. You know, we do actually have to create a whole army of researchers to do the work that is necessary within our communities and nations. Community evaluation and reporting is essential. Engaging, educating, and capacity building. So research is also, doing research in community is also a form of community education. And sometimes researchers forget that, but nonetheless, it is a function of the way I view and the way others are now viewing Indigenous research. The environmental view of Indigenous health research includes, you know, beginning with this notion of ecological integrity, which means start from the premise that what you do has integrity and honors life-giving relationship. You know, as you study Indigenous peoples, you come across a concept or a metaphor called, as we term it, for life's sake, we do this. It's a metaphor that sort of capsulizes why we do something and what the focus of what we're doing is, which is really to perpetuate not only individual life, but the life of the community, the life of the environment, the life of nature as a whole. So it's a life-centered kind of consciousness. Build in a sustainable orientation, build in a process which sustains community, culture, and place as one of the main criteria for the research that you do. have a vision and purpose, see what you can do in the light of revitalization of community and community health. And again, the vision and purpose really guides you, keeps you on that that road of understanding whatever you do has community value and should benefit community. The two slides, Pueblo people circa probably about 2,000 years ago, when the Pueblo communities were forming, first clans were forming, that would become the Pueblo people in the Southwest. And how one of our Pueblos, Taos Pueblo, looks today. You can see that there's an evolution, like the emergent story I told, moving from one world to the next, but there's also a continuity. And I think those traits are still very apparent among many indigenous people. The idea of having a purpose and an action for the action that you do, purpose and action. So have a purpose and act on that purpose. So this would include cultural integration. Actions originate through spiritual agency that stems from connection to a cultural way of being. So that idea of cultural integration at every step of the research process, every application and benefit of the research. A respect for all. Actions stem from respect for and celebration of community. Community is the medium and the message. So engaging the participation of community is one of the key criteria of the kind of indigenous research that I'm advocating. And again, I have to emphasize that much of this kind of work is actually being done by indigenous researchers. And I'm just advocating that we do more of it, that we move from beyond just pure academic research within universities that benefit primarily universities to a more hands-on, more community-based research that benefits community and indigenous peoples and nations. One of the hallmarks of indigenous worldview is relationship. We're all related. So building upon and extending relationships are an essential process of education and healthy development. And our indigenous peoples knew this. So, if you take a look at the history of indigenous education among any group of indigenous people, you'll find that that it always had a health-related goal, the health of individual or community in ways that allowed for the benefit of all, and also the health of the environment in which we lived. So this restoring and extending of the health of a community is a key goal. And every initiative should generate dynamic and creative processes and build relationships. So this early Pueblo painting by Pop Shuli, who was a Pueblo artist, represents a doe and her fawn, and also represents the idea that that we do this for for the next generation, for our kids, our grandkids, our great grandkids. It revolves around this notion of what kind of ancestors do we want to be. And so given that, there is a commitment or recommitment to family and community. The commitments that are required are commitments really to develop the necessary skills. So there's a purpose, for, going to a university besides just personal gain, that there's a commitment to learn necessary skills and bring those skills back to apply in the context of the kind of research paradigm that I'm advocating for. A commitment to a community renewal and revitalization, I think, is the hallmark of indigenous research today in many ways. And a commitment to mutual reciprocal action and transformative change. Changing and moving, and that idea of evolution, moving between the worlds, that was represented in that Pueblo emergence story is very much a part of this. So here's a Pueblo scene, a successful Pueblo hunter bringing his catch as honored guests into his home. The hunter telling the story of the hunt to the extended family, and also the animals that have given their lives, for the benefit of the family and the community, and really reinforcing, that bond of relationship, and not only within the family itself, the extended family itself, but the family to those sources of life. So what are some of the characteristics of this health education that I'm advocating for? It's, first of all, to educate for the recreation of community health around Indigenous paradigms. That's a key goal. Begin by learning the history and principles of your own Indigenous ways of health, and explore ways to translate that into the present, because we're in a contemporary life, and we have to find ways to translate these values, these ideas into the life that we live now, and hopefully extend that into the next generations. So the research is to research the practical ways to apply these Indigenous principles and knowledge bases to our work today, but also to incorporate what works, from other knowledge bases. That picture is a metaphor we use many times. We are all but corn, or we are kernels in the same corn cob. The corn cob constitutes the structure of community. The individual corn kernels are individuals, that comprise the community. And our characteristic is that we all sit on top of we are situated on the corn cob, but we are leaning against each other, as you see in these multi-colored kerneled corn. And I think it's an appropriate metaphor for what Indigenous community is, and its structure. Pueblos are famous for corn and for corn ceremonies, and we commemorate the life process of the corn from preparing the soil all the way to harvest, and we have corn dance celebrations, for each of those special times of the corn. But we actually have some shared principles for the change. Our traditional environmental knowledge actually are forms of complex adaptive systems knowledge that allowed us to actually adapt to and continue to flourish in many cases within our environments. And we also have and can have resourcefulness and industriousness, or be industrious. We can cooperate and collaborate. We can integrate difference in political organization. We build alliances and confederations. We can and continue to do trade and exchange. So these are some of the kind of principles and some of the activities that Indigenous people all over the world actually share with each other. And these are the kinds of activities and principles that we can bring to bear on the kind of work that we need to do with regard to research, and also with regard to improving the health of our communities. Challenges to sustainability of healthy communities, or sustaining healthy communities, are many and varied, of course. It includes establishing political self-determination, decolonization, and creating culturally responsive education within our schools, economic exploitation, dealing with those kinds of issues, poverty, the many diverse competing ideologies that we are exposed to, the need for almost continual political restructuring. And included in that is our individual diversity, identity redefinition, and also creating formal and informal institutions that actually propagate this kind of research process. And so I use the metaphor here, the visual metaphor of a Hopi farmer as he is cultivating his cornfield in the in an arroyo, what we call an arroyo. It's really a wash, and it looks like it's all sand, but actually you plant corn that is designed, because its roots are almost as long as its height. The roots go into the clay, which holds the minerals, and the clay is right under the sand. And so that's why you see amazing cornfields in these what look like sand beds in Hopi country. It's a form of technical, traditional ecological knowledge, plant hybridization, and just an example of the kinds of ways in which Native people were able to ingeniously adapt to their environments. So that metaphor, I think, carries over into what we have to think about, today in our communities. Other challenges include, the cultural, social, political, spiritual fragmentation that we witness, throughout society and even in our own communities. Creation of formal and informal institutions, which I mentioned, but I'm adding the caveat that we have to really focus on creating these institutions to focus on sustainability of Indigenous communities, sustainability, not just, production for the workforce, but sustainability. Flowing with heterogeneity, complexity, and differentiation, because things are in flux and they're changing constantly, and that rapidness of the changes is only increasing. And then political structuring when necessary. So that particular slide, is of a Pueblo farmer, which in mid-March will start preparing his garden, preparing the soil, preparing to plant the seeds. And I think that's what I want to really reflect on, is that in a lot of ways we're preparing the ground, to seed it and to begin to grow this idea of Indigenous research in new ways. So context for research of Indigenous sustainability include inclusion and reflection on the extended family, the clan, the tribe, viewing and looking at in very deep ways the community, the place, the region, really thinking about the kinds of political and social or professional trade organizations that need to be formed or already are formed, developing co-ops, federations and societies, that will be predicated, towards this goal of sustainability. And I do get in trouble sometimes. The corporation, which can be sustainable if founded on principles of sustainability. I many times get in trouble for mentioning the word corporation, but actually corporation are forms of community as well. You just have to build them around the right set of values and ethics, for them to work. They can work just as easily, for the benefit of community and for the goals of sustainability as they can for profit. And so, again, rethinking, in a lot of ways, the end goal of all of this, of course, is to gain a good harvest, to support ourselves and our families and our cultures through time and through generations. So, when you look at Indigenous research and you look at Indigenous health and you look at, the real challenges that we face as Indigenous people with regard to dealing with climate change, which is upon us and will become more severe as time goes by, we really have to take a new look at our own food traditions, Indigenous family, community, relationship, health, and education in ways that allow us to adapt ourselves, to the changes that are coming and the changes that are really upon us, and begin to rely on our own ways of knowing and understanding that actually have carried us through many generations and have the potential to do so, but they do have to be reintroduced in new ways, in ways combining with the best of Western knowledge to allow us to move forward into these trying times. But also not forgetting that it's always about a celebration of life, a celebration of who we are as Indigenous peoples. That indeed we are all kernels in the same basket. And this is inclusive not only of Indigenous peoples, but also non-Indigenous peoples, that we are all a part of this grand ecosystem called the Earth Mother. And we have to begin to think in those terms. We are all kernels in the same basket is the metaphor that I would use for that. So just giving credits to some of the photos that I used. And I am ready for some questions, from the audience. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing and move to the audience, I guess.
Brilliant.
Question time. So I hope that gives you some insights into perspectives and of course, I've written numerous articles about that presentation, and that presentation that I just made has various forms. That one, I wanted to emphasize research. I know, Yuma, I had sent you an article about sustainability, climate change, and development, which is kind of a treatise on some of the same thoughts I presented in this slide presentation, but really focusing on getting us to think beyond just reliance on external Western development models and beginning to build our own.
For sure. No, thank you very much for sharing the article, and obviously thank you very much for the knowledge that you've shared with us this afternoon. So yeah, I want to get right to questions. And the first question comes from Sandra. And they're asking, how has Indigenous research affected the ability to address COVID as it spreads through the Navajo and Hopi peoples? Or has the fracturing of Indigenous people placed their survival at risk?
Well, the answer to the second question, yeah, our survival is at risk, as Indigenous people in our communities. So I think that's why we have to take COVID. There's another level of seriousness to the COVID in that it is affecting many of our elders, in very, very specific kinds of ways. And of course, they're holders of, much of our traditional knowledge. So that's a very serious situation. Are Indigenous peoples creating approaches to community health, as we're dealing with the COVID? I think we are. I think practically all of the Indigenous communities that I know are using both Western methods as well as communal methods of dealing with, the crisis. Of course, we're group-oriented people, so not being able to congregate in face-to-face kinds of situations as we're used to doing, is problematic. It's a challenge, but nonetheless, I've seen just a lot of innovation going on within the communities themselves as they're communicating as we are right now, those that have computers and those that are, being kind of messengers of knowledge and perspectives back and forth. Also, a lot of families are recovering some of the traditional methods of keeping healthy, developing different ways to stay home and cook foods in holistic ways. So I see that there's a lot of the COVID is certainly drastic, but it's also stimulating creativity, and I see a lot of that going on in Native communities. I guess what I'm really advocating is that things that we've always done, things that we've done to adapt and to adjust to situations, that we have to kind of do more of that and do it more in a kind of strategic kind of process, both through education and through research, and that we can't just leave that education and research to external sources, and that we have to start doing it ourselves and doing it extensively among ourselves.
No, I love that piece. Thanks for the question, Sandra. Another question comes in from another Sandra. What is a good resource to learn more about health and environment connection?
Oh my gosh, there's extensive work actually, being done by many Native health workers around the connection of community health to Western health and health principles. Some of the best people that I know are CHRs. We call them CHRs, but they're community health workers or health resource workers. Here in the United States, they're called CHRs, and these are community people who basically are community health workers, and they kind of act as a liaison between the Western medical system and the Native communities. And they're usually transporting people around for their doctor's appointments, but they're also an amazing group of people that do have knowledge of both the community and Western medicine, and our ways, in many ways, facilitate education, among Indigenous community, with regard to health practices and health issues. So they're kind of our frontline workers, in all Indigenous communities, that I think we really need a lot of praise, and also that can be a foundation for the kind of research that I'm talking about, that's not done just by a university trained researcher, but is research that is towards practical ends, that can be done actually by anyone. So that's what I really want to emphasize, that is that we have our own capability of research in our communities among ourselves, if we think of it in those terms, and we develop that consciousness once again.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. So I think there's a couple of questions that are a little similar here. One's from Brenner and one's from Anne. So thanks for sharing. And then Brenner says, brilliant. Nyawan, could you expand upon what you mentioned before and what you would call Indigenous metaphors of research?
Yeah, well, those slides were just taking some of the ideas that are part of, when Western researchers talk about research and how they do research. And then what I did was I indigenized those criteria, those principles. And I thought, well, if Indigenous researchers are doing research in just Western ways, what real, there's some real challenges in that. So why not indigenize the way in which we view research ourselves? and begin to create sets of principles that allow us to really express ourselves as Indigenous people and bring in the Indigenous values and perspectives, bring in an Indigenous focus and action, to our research. And so that's the reason for that particular slide. And the other thing I want to emphasize is this creative synthesis, this creative integration that I think we are really a genius at. We've been able to do a lot of this, with Western knowledge, and at a practical level. But now we're at the place where we have to, I think, really do this as a practice in research. So that would be my my take on that. There's of course other Indigenous scholars that are writing papers and articles about what is Indigenous research and what does it entail and what are the key thoughts and perspectives. I guess the other comment, since I'm out of the institution, now, the thing that I would say is that a lot of research that is important for us as Indigenous people actually remains in the institution. If you're not a part of the institution or you don't know how to access it, you're not going to access that information. And if it's not translated into a form that makes sense to you at a community level, you're likely not going to use it. So there's a lot of gaps, between getting research from the institution to practical purpose within the community. And we have to begin to think about that, those gaps and how to begin to address them, by research is actually a very simple process. You see a problem, you see an issue, you begin to think about it. You say, well, what can we do about this? You maybe look up some things, use the internet, use whatever sources of information. You come up with some strategies and you try it out. That's basically research. And the fact is that we do it all the time. We've always done it as Indigenous people. The only thing I'm saying is bring it more to your consciousness, do it more consciously and call it a form of creating knowledge about what you need to do to address certain key issues in practical ways. And that's the Indigenous methodology, pure and simple. We've always done it. We are doing it right now. Going back to that other question of what's happening within Indigenous communities, we're looking at our diets, we're looking at our health, we're looking at our traditions, we're thinking about, how we can begin to address some of the issues of COVID, how to get food on the table, how to, get from point A to point B. All of those things, require some sort of, practical thinking, and that can be called research as well.
For sure. Thank you very much for that. So I'm just being aware of the time. I'm just going to pause. We'll get back to the questions. I just wanted to thank everybody who was able to join us today, who might have to go. So just to go through really, really quickly, I just wanted to thank everybody who needs to go, who could be here. We're going to continue on questions. Upcoming next month, we have Donald Fixico, who's an American writer and intellectual, a professor of history at Arizona State University. So be sure to sign in, check that out. Join us again next month. There will be a short survey that we request that you fill out, and that'll help us to improve these webinars in the future, as well as give us any additional insights that anybody might have. So I'll just get back to the questions, and we're going to keep going as long as you have time.
Okay, Yuma, can I take like a 2-minute break to go to the restroom? So just like 2 minutes.
100%, absolutely.
Okay, and you can do the same if you want to.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to continue on going through questions. If you guys want to keep typing, really appreciate all of the comments, and I'll be sure to read through all of them and make sure they're communicated and go through everyone's questions.
Okay, well, I'm back, drinking a lot of coffee, so I need to.
Amazing. I think I did want to jump back into the dialogue, not about the research, but I think it's about that sort of the imperial knowledge. So, you know, there's a rigidity of imperial knowledge by the scientific method, you know,
Yes,
and it
yes.
feels like convincing that knowledge, it's like, it feels sometimes like we're trying to convince that type of knowledge, you know, when we have certain ways of going about receiving knowledge, like ceremony, for example,
Yeah.
is you know, one that comes to mind. The role of ceremony, for example, as research. And I guess my one question for that, just to jump back into the same dialogue, would be, how do you know of any examples of scholars, people that are working together, working towards pushing, you know, the role of ceremony in like research?
Yeah, I think that you know, ceremony is a kind of research in an indigenous context, because we're sometimes ceremonies, particularly healing ceremonies, are conducted to address a particular issue, either the issue of the personal health of individual or individuals, or a situation that has arisen that requires attention, you know, with regard to healing, a healing process, evoking a healing process and bringing that into being as a part of the therapy, or the part of the this, you know, a part of the solution. It's a part of the solution. And so that I think that as we begin to really think about our own capacities to do that kind of work among ourselves, that that there's an empowerment. And you're right in saying that there's an imperial fortress, you know, in the context of institutions, you know. I'm very aware of that, you know, and it's both a cognitive, intellectual, as well as actually it's a physical, you know, presence as well. And I think that you know, part of our issues as Indigenous people is that we've deferred so much of our intellectual, you know, capacity to these institutions that will take it, but not necessarily give anything back in return. You know, there's not a mutual reciprocal process many times. Although, you know, they will give you education, but it's education on their terms, in their words. And so I know that many Indigenous scholars, you know, have dealt with these issues at a personal level, and also have dealt with it and in terms of what they do in and with these institutions. And there's a period of time where you just simply get tired of that. You know, I know I get tired of it. I just submitted an article to a Western journal. That was my essay, was in my words. Actually, it's the one that I sent you. And it was they gave me a hard time about it because I wasn't using Western jargon. I wasn't using their Western authorities, with regard to citing their research, so it's a whole system that really negates and really makes it difficult for Native people to participate in at an equal playing field in any case, and so so there are a lot of issues there. There's also a lot of knowledge that we could use, but again, it requires a translator, the ability of a person to go in there, get the information, knowledge, and then bring it back out and present it in a form that communities can use, can find usable. So I think those are the kinds of things that I try to put into the slide presentation, that we have these challenges that we still have to deal with, as we go about this transformative process. I saw a question about transformation, and what I mean by transformation is that is what we're going through right now. I'll give you an example of COVID. I mean, we're looking at how our systems are not working, our forms of communication are not working, our political systems, economic systems are not working with regard to the challenge of COVID. And so there has to be a process where we go through that, we transform that not working into something that is working. Okay, so that's transformative process. And I would advocate that as Indigenous scholars, Indigenous people, we've always been in that transformative mode. We've always been trying to transform what we're having to deal with in a Western society into forms that allow us to do what we feel we want to do as communities. But it's always a struggle. It's always a challenge. Education is both in some ways a solution, but it's also part of the problem. And so a lot of the work I've done over the years has been to indigenize education, particularly science education, in ways that allow us to begin to make this transformative journey that we need to make. Now I have to say that I see a lot of this going on already. We're doing it already. We're transforming, and we're creating, and we're evolving. Being an artist, I'll use the whole realm of Native arts. And Native arts was one of the places they let us do our own thing, okay, or more or less. And so as Native artists, we were able to innovate, to take and to recreate, so Native art is big, okay? It's not only an industry, it's also evolved, and we have many Native artists. That same thing hasn't happened in science or some of the other areas, okay? Although we do have Native scientists, and we do have people that are involved with Native education, we don't have anywhere near the numbers that we have as Native artists, okay? But the reason we have so many Native artists is Native artists were given, because Western society, to put art over here, didn't really consider it as more as a luxury, whereas we were doing art, and we were able to use art as a way to express ourselves and to also make some money at it. So that's an example, okay, that I think what has to happen in the sciences. We have to begin to do what we've done as Indian artists, make science our own, and then move that on to this whole process of community building and community health. Make that community building and that community health our own. So climate change, is a real problem, real issue. And it's impacting, just like COVID, it's impacting Indigenous communities disproportionately, and will continue to do so. But it also offers an opportunity, if we're willing to take it, to transform our thinking in ways that allow us to sustain and to maintain into the future.
Brilliant.
So that's what I think, and that's why I couched this presentation the way that I did. Is that I'm challenging and instigating and planting seeds in the minds, and I've done this pretty much most of my career. And the two books that I mentioned out of Vernon, Canada, there in BC, by John Carlton Press, those are my students that have taken some of these ideas, so I seeded the students, and they've come up with some amazing things that show you how this process works, at least at the academic level, to begin to seed students with ideas and begin to create research projects that really are benefiting Native communities, and really, challenging the system, challenging that imperial system that you talked about.
I'd like to ask you a couple more questions if you have the time,
Sure.
if that's okay. Yeah. First, I'm going to read a couple comments, just some really nice comments. Dear Dr. Cajete, thank you for an interesting and informative presentation. I rethink something approaches, sent a letter to your university email, keep in touch. That's from Moscow. Thank you, Dr. Cajete. Your people are my prayers. Another one from Sandra says, thanks for the presentation and insights. I studied at the U of L with Leroy Little Bear. That's who first introduced me to your work. And then Noella writes, we all need to read about Dr. Cajete's work and start to plan our people's future and our children's future. Just going back up to one of the earlier questions, and it's somewhat similar, but can you provide an example of Indigenous scaffolding in research, Miigwech?
Oh, okay. So the idea of scaffolding is that you do some kind of baseline research that provides you with some idea or solutions or perspectives. And then when you move that research to the next level, you build on that. So it's scaffolding. So you build a foundation, you stand on it, then you start building another foundation based on that foundation, you stand on it, and gradually what you have is a kind of a ladder that you're climbing, a scaffold, that moves you deep, and it can also be in depth as well as height. It moves you into an issue more deeply, or into a solution more deeply, or it can move you higher into broader and broader levels of expression of that idea or that perspective or that approach. So scaffolding is something, and all research happens really this way. You begin with a basic research idea, you learn some things from it, you take what you've learned and you apply it to the next level of learning. And then you do the same thing, next level of learning, until you begin to really develop a broad sense as well as a depth of understanding of what you're researching. And so the more research you do in a particular kind of area, the deeper and the more expertise you develop over time. And so there's a time factor, of course, the research that I've done in Indigenous education, it's a result of 46 years of pretty much researching the same ideas, but developing a breadth and also a depth to my understanding and my insight. And that's what research, helps you to do. And in a lot of ways, our Indigenous societies, our traditional knowledge, also is a scaffold. The more you deal with it, the more you work with it, the more deeper an understanding you have of it, and the broader perspective you have with it. So it has the same kind of function as other research does.
I like that. It reminds me of sort of like that. That would be our version of the imperial knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
So Noella asks, says, thank you for bringing your research to the grassroots. You have given us guidelines. We have to know there are cultural protocols and some knowledge rights are given to a few. You have to be patient, but wait for the youth to catch up. How can we influence First Nations leadership to give your research guidelines a priority?
Well, that's a great question, because a lot of my work at the University of New Mexico, the Native Studies program, is I reformed it as a leadership program. Using Native Studies to really reform the next generation of Native leaders, so that they're beginning to think in these terms and not so much in Western terms of leadership, but begin to really integrate traditional perspectives, understandings, and insights into their expression of leadership. And I think that's the wave, in Indigenous leadership education today, more so than it was, let's say, 10 years ago. So it's a gradual process. Again, it's like that scaffolding that we've just talked about, but it's beginning to make some real changes. I know that that leaders and leadership education is an essential component of this kind of transformative thinking. So first of all, I think that every Indigenous person, through a process of research, can become a leader. They learn to be leaders with regard to that kind of research, and that as that begins to permeate their thinking, they begin to apply those same ideas to other aspects of leadership. So that so in Indigenous communities, everyone had a purpose, everyone had insight, everyone had a role. And in some ways, one can say that everyone was indeed a leader, either of others or within their family. And then, of course, you had leaders that were elected, that were hereditary, that had the confidence of large groups of people, to lead and to do work for the community as a whole. But I know that there are a lot of Indigenous researchers working on this whole notion of what is Indigenous leadership, and how should we begin to create Indigenous leaders now and into the future, with regard to some of these ideas that I've just presented in the presentation. And so we tried to do that at the University of New Mexico Native Studies program, and the faculty that I left, in charge of that program now are moving it, to the next level, to the PhD level, and beginning to really apply some of these ideas, in the context of Western academic leadership. So, so it's evolving, this concept of leadership. I know that there are lots of different kinds of issues, with regard to Indigenous leadership, that are primarily the result of the way the leader was educated. Okay, and that's why I look at education very, very seriously, because education is a form of conditioning, towards a certain way of viewing things, a way of doing things. There is a Western leadership playbook, if you will, and that's why you find that in the Western institutions, leadership kind of looks the same, regardless of which institution you're in, because there's actually a playbook, that leaders learn, and they learn to apply, and that they're conditioned for. So what I'm saying is that let's develop our own forms of leadership playbooks. And I know that there in Canada, a lot of this work is happening out of the Banff Center, and they're beginning to look at Indigenous leadership. Someone mentioned Leroy Little Bear. and some of the work that he does in University of Lethbridge, that's also happening. So the leadership piece is a very big piece of this, right? Because you do have to, as a leader, you do have to have a sense for this kind of thinking if you're going to perpetuate it in your community or your organization.
Mm-hmm. And is there any work that you could recommend, or do you have any vision for parsing out for non-Indigenous, to whether it's accomplices or allies?
Well, allies are very important, and I think that what I've seen, over these past few years is that, let's say, particularly with regard to ecology and sustainability education, that a lot of non-Indigenous scholars are right on the money. They're moving in exactly these directions. And they're beginning to become more open and utilizing Indigenous thought in new kinds of ways. What's important is for us as Indigenous people to not, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they would say, that we have to be just as innovative with our ideas and applying those ideas within our own context and our own communities. I know that there's a lot of people that would say, well, non-Indigenous people are exploiting Indigenous thought, and to a certain extent, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. But in some ways, that's also a process of transformation. And the key is that we not be left out of that process, in the sense that we are not evolving our own transformative thinking based on our own paradigms.
Mm.
And so that's the purpose of what you will call indigenizing an educational system, which is a concept that is happening in a variety of ways. So language revitalization, reviving certain cultural practices, bringing that, as you're doing in Canada, with the Truth and Reconciliation, situation, trying to bring that into the schools and higher education. All of that is a part of this transformative process that I'm talking about. In many ways, I wish that was happening in the United States to a much greater extent than it is, but it is happening there. So you need to develop leaders who are, and I think you do have leaders who are right on top of this, But like the United States, you also have leaders that aren't. so gotta weigh the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to remember some of the examples. It doesn't matter. I wanted to keep going with the questions, but so Jocelyn Peltier is asking, I was thinking about decolonizing education. What does this look like, and how can we implement or integrate transformative education using Indigenous knowledge into a school system that's deeply embedded with a Western ideology?
Well, I would say read my book, Igniting the Sparkle, an Indigenous science education model. I actually that was my doctoral dissertation, is how I did it at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and how it can actually be done in schools and school setting. It's focusing on really creating viable, culturally relevant education programs, within our schools. And so a lot of this already is going on, particularly with Indigenous schools. But again, that challenge of the imperial wall, i.e. the Western institutions of accreditation and of schooling itself, continue to be real roadblocks, that are challenging that. But many of our native language programs, many of our community education programs that focus on cultural revitalization, are already doing this. We just have to begin to focus more on them in ways that we bring in, this kind of research that I'm talking about. Because anytime you make a change, it's a transformation. If you make, whether it's large or small, if it's doing something different and more impactful than what you've done before, you're making a transformation. So transformation is not this huge, although it can be, because little transformations accumulate and they reach a critical mass, and then it becomes a large transformation. But the fact is that we're doing transformations all the time. We just don't call it that, So it's interesting to me that transformation is somewhat of a new term, being brought into education, when actually it really isn't. Transformation is change. Transformation means change. And so big changes, little changes, but you have to know and understand the nature of change, how you change a system. And it's a process. And so in schools, the way you change the way a school does schooling, does education, is you change and you transform the curriculum. So the teachers have to become creators of curriculum once again. Right now, they are just performers of external curriculums. Those external curriculums are mandated by the state or the province or the nation, national curriculums, but they're external and they're not necessarily created by the teachers themselves. Indigenous education is actually created from the grassroots with regard to the community and the needs of the community, the culture of the community, the language of the community. And it brings forward, those ideas into the teaching and learning of different kinds of subjects. And so there is a process to that. This has been happening, all along in Indigenous education, and is continuing to happen. You can see it most visibly in the language programs that have been established by most Native communities, language revitalization programs. We're trying to do it now with regard to science programs and science learning, because we need more Native scientists who are both trained in Western science, but also very cognizant of Indigenous knowledge and understandings. And so it's the people that bring these knowledge systems together in their practice and in their consciousness, and how they do the work that they do. And the same thing would be true with Indigenous health workers, Indigenous business, Indigenous leaders.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that concept.
So all of this is happening in Canada as we speak. I mean, there's lots of people that are doing this kind of work. I'm reminded of Marie Baptiste, out of the University of Saskatchewan there. It's also happening in law, so it's really across the board. So I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on, but I think those are the ideas I would have, with regard to that question. I just want to emphasize there's plenty of research, there's plenty of research now in all of the areas that the questions have been asked in terms of transformative education. I know Vicki Kelly out of, I can't remember which school she's in. They're in Vancouver, Victoria area, but she has a concept called two-eyed seeing, the ability to understand and integrate both a Western and an Indigenous view simultaneously, and come up with something new. So a lot of Indigenous educators in Canada are into this, and they're doing this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. No, I love the idea. Like in Ontario, we have like language nests.
Yeah.
But that idea doesn't come from here. And I love the idea of having something similar for Indigenous sciences, like that
Yeah,
sounds brilliant to me. I'd love to see that.
right.
So we have a question, Annie Bojo from Garden River. Do you think ceremonial group work or gathering for the future will be drastically different or even exist like they were pre-COVID?
I think they will exist in time, because of the fact that, I don't think COVID, particularly with the vaccines that are promising, will be with us for so long that it totally transforms everything that we've done in the past. But I think we'll have to make adjustments, smaller groups, groups gathering within family groups, smaller groups, more particularly family, getting together and working some of these ceremonial gatherings together. I think that you can begin to do a lot at the individual level, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people just coming together. And social distancing, of course, right now, but a little bit later on, just developing a working group, as they would call it, where you continue to do your same practices, but it's scaled down, to a very few people. But you still are continuing, because you don't lose the essence of it. You can even do it just with 2 people or 1 person, just continue to do those practices, and it's in your mind's eye and the extension of your heart, your affectivity, that causes the effect of the ceremony or the ritual. So you just concentrate on that, you just doing things mindfully, with regard to that ritual, even if you're doing it just by yourself, all of that, it still has impact, regardless of the size of the group that you're working with.
Agree. I think this will be the last question, and I just want to thank everybody very much for all of the comments and the questions. Hello, thank you for this awesome webinar. I'm a settler and I'm curious about how to support Indigenous traditional revitalization. I'm wondering if institutional funds for Indigenous research have been helpful in the past, and if liberated research is harder to fund. Is there a way for settlers to contribute funds to research? And is this a meaningful action settlers can take to support Indigenous revitalizations without prescribing outcomes?
Yes, to that.
I think so too.
I would say certainly there's ways to support this, but I think let me talk a little bit about the non-Indigenous interest in things Indigenous. I think it's important not only to be supportive of Indigenous peoples in their quest, to be Indigenous people, but also that there is so we get into this concept of mutual reciprocal action. So giving forward, of whether it's resource or support on the part of a non-Indigenous person, will come back in a variety of different kinds of ways to that person. In our ways of Indigenous thinking, it's that mutual reciprocal process. So it comes back in a variety of different kinds of ways, hard to tell. But certainly it's not only the feeling of making connection and creating new friends and new relationships, but also that that it's a kind of healing. It's a healing that is reciprocal, both in terms of its impact on Indigenous people and the work that they're doing, but also the fact of giving is always a healing act that brings back to the giver new insight into themselves. Certainly education, because there's a reciprocal exchange of knowledge usually in some of these cases where the non-Indigenous person is learning something new and gaining insight about themselves and about their own history, about their own situation, about, creative possibilities of the future. And so that's a mutual reciprocal process that is very important. It's very important to do that. And it's going on a lot, actually, mostly informally. And I guess the question was how to make it more formal in terms of actual resources, going into Indigenous research. It's a matter of just setting up a foundation. Even what a lot of Indigenous people are doing now, what's called crowdsourcing, where small donations are being given to a certain cause for a certain purpose. Share resources, to share knowledge, and also at the very same time to gain something as a result of doing that. So that's what I would say, that there needs to be more of it, and the more there is of it, the stronger the healing process becomes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your time again. I love you brought it back to the reciprocity, and I think that's paramount. And I really appreciate your time. I want to thank everybody who was here in attendance with us today, and just to be on the lookout for the next session next month. Did you want to say anything to the attendees yourself there?
No, I just, it was a pleasure to, have this opportunity to share some thoughts and perspectives. And I hope I've given you some food for thought, as you move forward, with your own work, with your own creativity and your own healing. And certainly, I think that's one of the best ways to deal with many of the issues that we have is to put yourself in a positive, mindful mindset and move forward with this mutual reciprocal action of giving and receiving, because that's really what Indigenous philosophies, wherever you find them in the world, tell us. It's about, it's a life-centered or a life perpetuating philosophy. So we give life to each other in this kind of way. So it's for life's sake that we do this. And I think that's what I would say. Thank you, Yuma, for your good moderation, and hopefully we'll see each other again, maybe in person one of these days.
Absolutely. Miigwech to you. And with that, I'm going to end the webinar, and thanks very much. Bye, everybody.